Cambria is another one of our amazing members, was on the leadership team for quite a long time, helped Melissa and Rosanna with the development of the learning exchanges, and also an awardee of a community mini grant. And so Cambria, we're excited to listen and learn.
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit kind of what I did with the grant money, and then I'm actually going to kind of run you through a brief synopsis of what I did with it. So I used it to put together a webinar on trauma-exposed workplaces, navigating uncertain times, and specifically looking at our current kind of dual crises that are going on around the pandemic and around the issues of inequity. And this has been quite a 2020 and now into 2021. I think we all kind of hoped that 2021 was going to turn the page, and it's turned a page all right, but not quite into where I think we had hoped. And so I think we as a society, we as a nation are really still kind of navigating some very uncertain times and very challenging times, and that's probably going to continue on for a little while. So I created a webinar, which I apologize, I don't have the link to, but Dana probably does, because it's on the YouTube channel for the guide team. And so folks are welcome to go in and watch the recording. It's free and available to all of you. So what I did with that was I kind of looked at the impacts of working in a trauma-exposed workplace, especially in light of the current events that were going on. I did this back in I believe it was September, and I will say that while things have changed, there's still, we haven't moved as far, I think, from September as many of us probably had hoped in terms of where we're at with COVID. And in fact, I think things have kind of heated up in many ways. And so I think the information there is probably still quite relevant. I also talk in there about coping strategies, and I'll share, briefly a few of those with you as we talk through this today as well, and ways to kind of get support from colleagues and to be able to look at doing that during these times as well. So I start off, really asking folks to think about, and it's interesting having just listened to the presentation that they did in terms of talking about everybody's kind of lived experiences and personal experiences, in realizing that we're all experiencing, a lot of people have been like, well, we're all kind of in the same boat, right? This is a big shared trauma. And I actually like to think about the fact that I think that we're all on the same really big sea, but we're all in very different boats, and we're all in kind of different places on this sea, right? So you can see my pictures of boats here. Some of us are in, kind of really small boats. Some of us are in really large boats. Some of us have a lot of people on our boats. Some of us have nobody on our boats. Some of us are in boats that are really kind of floating quite well through this, and others are in boats that are pretty leaky and that are really quite impacted by what's going on in the world around us. And so I think it's important to consider that when you're thinking about how you look at your own self and your own self-assessment, but also in how you relate to others. And when we think about this, I think it's really easy, and I've worked with a lot of groups around the country over the past several months around this issue. And it's interesting because I think it's really easy for people to look at what other people are experiencing and think, oh, well, the grass is so much greener for them. It's so much better for them, right? But I think the reality is we think everybody's, kind of in this unicorn and rainbow except us. But the reality is no one is in a situation where things are wonderful and top notch right now. And everybody has kind of their personal challenges that are going on. And so as we relate to each other within our organization, as we relate to clients, it's important to really kind of think about that and keep that in mind. So the model that I use in terms of talking about this is comes out of some work that was done by Dr. Leslie Ann Ross, who's one of my colleagues who used to work for Children's Institute Los Angeles. She actually now works for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's National Center out of UCLA. And some work that's been done with an STS consortium, which is a secondary traumatic stress consortium that I am also a part of, and work with several colleagues across the US and actually in Canada as well, as we kind of have been digging in and looking at this issue. So the first piece, when we think about kind of risk and resiliency when you're working in a trauma-exposed workplace, and specifically kind of honing in on the current times, we think about direct exposure, right? And in the past, we would think, well, that's mostly people who are first responders that are going out and are directly in harm's way. But what we find now with what's going on with COVID, what's going on, with a lot of the Black Lives Matter and the current protests and riots and such that we saw yesterday, that that direct exposure looks a little bit different at this point, that people are in harm's way in a different way than they've been in the past. So, if you think about folks who are working in healthcare, for instance, in the past, their direct exposure to something traumatic might have been a lot less. And now, working in healthcare can feel very like you're in the direct line of fire. That, are you being impacted by COVID? Is it something that now is going to impact you directly, and that you're going to be exposed at work and then bring that exposure home to your families? We see that, anybody who's doing direct service work and is still in the direct service arena and not doing things remotely has a direct exposure to something that they didn't have a direct exposure to in the past. So important to kind of keep that in mind. And how that looks in different agencies. It's also important to keep that in mind. That looks different in different places. Some people are working primarily remotely. Some people are doing some in-person services. There's a lot of agencies where there's some of both happening. And so keeping in mind, what does that mean in terms of how does that feel if you're working mostly remotely, but colleagues are going in and doing direct services in person, or vice versa, and what kind of dynamics does that set up within an organization, within a team, or within collaborations as you're working with people. So having some understanding of that. The next area of risk and resiliency that we think about is indirect trauma. And this is, the stories that we hear, the experiences of other people that come to us. We often talk about this as secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, but it's this idea that you're not impacted yourself, but you're hearing how other people are, right? So if you're working with clients and they're telling you about how they're being impacted by COVID, then you're carrying that with you as well. We also are seeing a lot of indirect trauma just by media exposure, right? Like you turn on the TV and you start hearing about what's going on out in the world. And so you're hearing all of those experiences, and that material is all, having an impact. So, much more so than the past. I mean, the news has always been filled with pretty depressing stuff, but it's 24/7 at this point. I think when you turn it on, you can't get far away from hearing about what's going on with the pandemic, what's going on with the riots, some of the different pieces around race and inequity that are going on. It's just constant in the news. And so you're certainly hearing it, that perspective as well. And then, as I said, the personal perspectives from clients that you're working with. So how much of that you're intaking certainly can have an impact on how much you're being impacted by working in a trauma-exposed workplace. Personal vulnerability. So this speaks a lot to what the two folks earlier were talking about, is really kind of looking at what's your individual experience in this. And this goes back to that idea with all the different boats, that some of us are in places where we may not have as much personal vulnerability to what's going on, and other people very much so. And there's also, and it's been very interesting as I've talked with folks around the country about this also, there's also extremely different experiences that people are having in different parts of the country. In different sections of different places. Some places schools are open, some places schools are closed. So, what that means in terms of people trying to work and educate their children and take care of their children at the same time, or dealing with very different school schedules than were ever in place in the past, right? So all of that impacts how much you're being impacted by what's going on in current times as well. And, what does that mean for you? What is your past history of lived experience with trauma, and how might that be being triggered by what's happening currently? So everything that's kind of individual to you, again, is going to feel different than it is for other people who are in the same situation. And again, important to remember when you're working with other people that you don't always know all of their personal history or their current vulnerabilities. And so being able to have some grace around that and some understanding that people may not be at their most productive, right, in the same way that they were in the past. And also in understanding how you're challenges right now might impact other people. One of the very interesting things I think that's come about in the corporate world is, a lot of talk about the whole childcare issue and how do you support parents and how do you make sure that they're able to be there and take care of their children. And in some ways, I think there was a extreme effort in some places, Facebook being one of them, where they passed all these rules and they said, okay, well, parents, can have this much leave and this much support. And then people who were not currently parenting were like, well, what about us? Now we're left to shoulder all of this. And, maybe we're feeling really isolated because we're at home alone and we don't have anybody to interact with, right? So having that understanding of, what does it look like for those that you're working with, both your clients, but also the people that you work with on the different teams and collaborations that you're doing as well. Looking at work-related traumatic grief and loss, this is huge in this age. The big T's certainly, people being very impacted by COVID, and there are certainly people who are losing colleagues to this, or are having colleagues that are, seriously impacted. Their health is seriously being impacted by COVID, and that can be very traumatic. And then certainly, clients as well. And so all of that comes together also as something that can make you more at risk. And the little T's as well, just the changes that are happening in terms of financial loss and job loss and all of the things that are happening for folks as a result of what's going on can impact you as you're working with clients, can impact you personally, depending on what's going on in your own personal life as well. So the lines become a lot more blurred, I think, than they were in the past, because we are all, having this kind of myriad of different things that are going on in society. Oops. The idea of empathic strain, which used to be referred to as compassion fatigue, which is the idea that it can just be really tiring to day in and day out be trying to have a lot of empathy for people who are going through really difficult circumstances, and that empathy can then be strained, and you can find yourself kind of dissociating and not feeling like you're as present in terms of being able to work with clients. And so really needing to take a look for yourself in terms of where you're at with that, and how much do you have to give, and the fact that you need to attend to your own needs in order to really be able to be present for those that you're working with. Systems failure is the idea that basically not all systems always work together well, right? And so sometimes you may work as hard as you can in your system. Let's say you're a child welfare worker, you're working as hard as you can on a case, and you really, feel like it needs to go a certain way, and then it goes to court, and the court makes a totally different decision than what you were pushing for. And then you now have to live with that and kind of work with that. We see that with mental health, working with kids who are in the system, or working with kids or families who are in substance abuse systems, or in, the various different probation and delinquency types of systems that then are having to deal with, they don't have control over what some of the decisions are being made in these other systems. And yet you have to sit there and try to figure out how to support the people that you're working with. And so having, an understanding of the fact that that certainly is impacting us, and systems are being very impacted by what's going on right now. In child welfare systems, the whole way of visitation has totally changed. You can't have in-person visitation in the way that you could in the past. And so all of these different systems are trying to shift and adjust to this. And you can only do so much in the specific role that you have in dealing with some of the policies and procedures that are being put in place. And then working conditions kind of goes hand in hand with that within your own working system. What is that looking like, and how much support are you being given? If you have, if you are trying to juggle taking care of kids and working, what does that look like, and what kind of support is being given to you? And we see that being, a huge challenge for different organizations to kind of figure out right now. And people, it's constantly kind of this sense of change of, okay, now this is working, and then something shifts and you have to figure out a different way of being able to do things. And I think we're now in an interesting place where we have to start preparing for what happens next, right? As the vaccines are being rolled out, as things are, going to hopefully at some point be able to return to people going and being in person with each other again, then what does that start to look like? And how do you start preparing yourself for that? And how do organizations start preparing for that to happen? And kind of snuck in here in between is this idea of moral distress. And that's the idea, when working conditions aren't good, when systems are failing, there's only so much that you can do as an individual. This really came out of the world of nursing. And they looked at the fact that, the reality is that you can't you can't always make all the decisions. So if you're a nurse and a doctor puts orders in, for instance, and says, this is the treatment plan for this particular patient, you have to follow that as a nurse. You can give some input, but ultimately you have to follow the plan, even if you feel like that might not be in the client's best interest, right? And we see that happening in other fields as well, where there's this sense of like, okay, I have to, follow through with what the expectation is, even if I don't think that's the best way to handle this particular case. And that can be really challenging. And then finally, but last but not least, is the sociocultural context, and really looking at, how are people being impacted based on their own kind of backgrounds and their own social contexts and cultural contexts, and having an understanding, and we certainly do with the pandemic, of, there's a huge amount of disparities within this pandemic. And so what somebody who's, coming from the South Bay area, for instance, where we know the numbers have been really, really high, and you start looking and digging into that, you can see some of the reasonings behind that. And, having some understanding of what that looks like and what that feels like for people who are in those particular situations is really critical. And being able to evaluate and have awareness of your own, kind of social cultural context and how that may be impacting you. So if you think about it, if you are like myself, if you're, a Caucasian provider and you're working with families that are African American during the Black Lives Movement, what does that feel like for me as a Caucasian provider versus what might that feel like for somebody who is of the same background, right? Who's coming from this and has their own history of feeling oppressed and having certain things happening. And so, being able to look at that and have an understanding that we all, again, have different perspectives, different kind of lived experiences that impact how things impact us, and that there are groups in which there are different circumstances as well. So then I'm leaping far ahead because there's a lot more that I talk about in the presentation, but I always like to make sure that people have some strategies. And so I want to share those a little bit with you today. So there were 5 strategies that I talked about. I talk about them much more in depth in the webinar. And as I said, you can watch the recording. But thinking about building competence and confidence, so one of the strategies to deal with being in a trauma-exposed environment is to really look at how do you feel more confident and competent in the work that you do? What kind of professional development do you need? What are the areas that you feel like if you felt more competent in, that you might be able to build some more resilience? So a good example of that, having worked in a hospital for many, many years and working with nursing staff, when you ask them, well, what are the areas that are really challenging for you in a pediatric hospital situation? Many of them say, well, working with really difficult parents. I don't have a lot of training on how to deal with really difficult parents, and they yell and they're upset, understandably, because of what's going on with their child. And I don't know how to interact in a way that feels helpful with that. And so it winds up feeling extremely stressful to me. And then I start, being much more susceptible to trauma from the stories and the instances that I'm hearing and the things that are happening in my day-to-day work. So looking at ways to build that competence and confidence, finding ways to have predictability, which is so key right now with everything that's going on, because it feels like the only thing that's really predictable right now is that things are extremely unpredictable, right? So finding little ways to have predictability, whether it's, just knowing, okay, on, Fridays, I'm going to make sure that I take some time to connect with family over Zoom on Friday afternoons, or, that with my children with school, I'm going to make sure that, we have a check-in every Tuesday and kind of talk about how is online schooling going and what do we need to make some adjustments for this week, right? So looking at little places where you can try to have some control and some predictability for yourself and for those around you. Micro practices and incorporating mindfulness. I gave some examples here of mindfulness techniques that take less than 2 minutes because nobody has a whole lot of time these days. So these are things that you can do very, very quickly. Things like just focusing on a word such as calm or peace, counting backward from 10, different breathing pieces, paying attention to the sounds around you. Reading about something positive. The Good News Network, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a great place to go and be able to tune into some good things that are happening in the world versus all of the really difficult stuff that's going on. So I really suggest that as a great website. Some other micro practices, and the idea behind micro practices, again, are things that you can do very quickly, right? So things like stretching, getting up for a movement break if you're spending a long time at the computer, Writing down 3 things that you're feeling really grateful about, having a self check-in and kind of knowing where you're at with things. Having some transition rituals. What do you do between seeing clients or between meetings or between working and home, even if it's going to the next room. And a lot of people have talked about, kind of this fatigue of everything is being done virtually and I'm working from my home. And so it feels like work and home has gotten all mashed, right? So what are the things that you can do to kind of unhinge those things? And it can be simple things like at the end of the day, you put something over your computer, so you don't have to see your computer and it doesn't sit there as a reminder. Or that you do something as you're leaving work and you say, okay, every day when I walk out of the room that I'm doing work in or the space that I'm doing work in, I'm going to, take 3 deep breaths and I'm going to let go of the day and be able to move on from that. But thinking about what are those things that you use to transition, and using those really small times that you might have when you're brushing your teeth or you're taking a bathroom break or you're getting your coffee, to have kind of those moments to reflect and take a few deep breaths, or count to 10 or think of something that you're grateful for. And then micro movements, similar to micro practices, again, things you do really quickly, making small incremental changes rather than rushing into big changes that you can't achieve or sustain, breaking down large projects into really small action steps that aren't overwhelming so you can easily fit them into your busy schedule. And these things allow you to really kind of gain some clarity on what needs to be done as you move forward so it can propel you into action, right? So planetsark.com, she does a lot of work around this. Her micro movement piece is mostly around people who are trying to do writing, like who are writing novels or books. But I think a lot of the lessons and ways that she breaks things down can be really helpful. And again, I talk more about kind of this in the webinar as well. And then looking at the culture of support and knowing how do you get support from each other in these difficult times, and realizing that because everybody is carrying so much with them right now, that it's really easy to transition what you're feeling to somebody else, right? And to have even what we might call tertiary traumatic stress, right? So you take what you've heard from a client and then you go and you talk to a colleague about it, and suddenly, they're having to carry that piece as well. And so this idea of low impact debriefing is a really nice model for being able to talk about those kind of difficult cases and share with people when you're not in a situation where you're having to do an in-depth, case consultation, but you really just need some support because you've had some difficult things that have gone on. And you can use it around sharing client stories. You can also use it around just sharing, what's going on with you personally and how much, kind of in depth we go. I think the tendency is that we kind of want to get very graphic. And I think we sometimes in this work get very desensitized to what the things that we hear about and how much that impacts other people. So thinking about that and having some self-awareness of why am I asking for some support right now? And then whoever you're going to, giving them fair warning, and combining that with consent, with the idea of, I had a really difficult session or something, kind of difficult has happened in my personal life and I could really use a couple minutes to talk about it. Would this be an okay time for that to happen? And if the person, has just had their own difficult thing happen and can't take anything more on, being accepting of the fact that somebody might say, this isn't really a great time. Maybe we could talk later, or, maybe you can try to find someone else to enlist to provide that support right now. So when you're working in organizations, especially, kind of having some organizational understanding of this so that everybody's on the same page to realize that it's okay to say, this isn't a good time for me right now. And then the idea of limited disclosure and really looking at, what is it that you need to disclose? Do you need to tell every detail about what's happened in that difficult encounter or the difficult thing that's going on in your life? Or is it more that you need to talk about, some of the feelings or what's happened, what this has triggered for you? So a good example of that is, if you're working with a child who's been sexually abused and you feel like you need to go and talk with somebody about the feelings that that's brought up with you because you got a lot of graphic details from that child. Is it the graphic details that you need to share, or is it the fact that maybe that child is the same age as your child and it's bringing up a lot of kind of feelings for you about what is it like to hear that from a child and think about your own child, right? And it's very different to go to a colleague and say, oh, well, this is all the, things that have happened to this child and kind of emotionally vomit, if you will, all over them, than to say, gosh, I had this really difficult case and the child was about the same age as my child. And it's really brought up all these feelings for me about how unsafe the world can feel and, how difficult it can be. And to have that type of conversation, which can be a very different conversation. So again, kind of holding that self-awareness and looking at what is it you really need to disclose to get the support that you need. And there's more information on this in the webinar and also from Tend Academy, which is where this comes from. It's cited on the bottom here. And then these are some additional websites. I also, as part of the post the webinar, after putting that together, I put together a resource sheet, and I'm going to figure out, Dana, how to get that to you so that can get posted with these notes as well. That has some additional resources. It has all these websites listed and a lot of the kind of websites that I referred to in my kind of brief overview today, so that folks can get some more information in this area as well. So that is just a quick kind of snapshot of what I've been working on, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it.